Good evening, everybody. So welcome back to all of you who were here last week, and very welcome to anybody who's joined since then. So we are discussing this morning, or should I say, where I am at the moment in Ireland, it's actually the evening, it's 8 o'clock in the evening here. So we are discussing the history of Jews in Ireland. So last week, just to recapitulate a little bit, we were talking about essentially 12 hairy men that may or may not have fallen out of a boat in 1079 in the south coast and may or may not have stayed. We talked a little bit about the Crusades. We went on to talk about the Jewish settlement here really in the 17th century under Cromwell. We talked a little bit about the Pereira family. They're sort of a wealthy and very, very powerful and influential Jewish family who migrated from Portugal to the British Isles under Cromwell. So we're really talking about 1655 or thereabouts. We discussed the little restoration synagogue that existed in Dublin in the city centre. We discussed the synagogues, the one mysterious synagogue in County Meath, which is, deep in the heart of the country, and also the one just on the outskirts of Dublin city. So we talked about that. And we talked a little bit about the migration of Jews over to Ireland from the Russian Federation. And that's really where we stopped. So this week, I think there's quite a lot of material to get through, but I will leave some time at the end for questions. So if you've got a question, maybe save it up till then, or you can always try and make contact afterwards if that's what you prefer. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to really start again from the 1882 discriminatory May laws in Russia passed by Tsar Alexander III. Now, Tsar Alexander II, if you're interested, was actually quite sympathetic to Jews, but when he died and his son acceded, he really, really made life very difficult, or more difficult, for the Jews right across the Russian Federation. And that was really the point at which that Jewish migration started west. And, whereas I know an awful lot of people wound up, at this time in the United States, I'm just really going to concentrate on the relatively small number of Jews that landed in Ireland from the 1880s onward, because an awful lot of the remaining Jewish community in Dublin now, and I'm mostly talking about Dublin this evening, would be descended from those people, including myself, certainly on my father's side. My mother's family, in fact, came here somewhat earlier in, we believe, the 1870s, and we believe that her grandfather was, in fact, brought over here as a master upholsterer of all things. But on my father's side, certainly they had quite an interesting time leaving Latvia. So we'll move on a little bit to that then. So we started talking last week about the formation of synagogues on the south side of the city. Now, Dublin, if you don't know this, Dublin is bisected by the River Liffey. So prior really to this time that I'm talking about now, the main centre of Jewish occupation was in fact on the north side of the city, and we discovered this little synagogue in a place called Mary's Abbey that was established in the 1830s in what was a former Unitarian chapel by a group of German Jews who came to live here, very settled, very middle class, well educated. And again, this changed. So this whole dynamic of the Jewish community changed then from the 1880s, because we had this very small and integrated group of German Jews, and then suddenly they're joined by this relatively large influx of Jews from Russia with, very different culture and very different traditions. And they settled in a different part of the city. And last week we talked a little bit about that. I showed you some of the streetscape of this outside of Dublin. Now I'm going to try and show you. So hopefully this all works. We're going to try and show you some things. So this is more or less where we left off last week. So this is the synagogue that I told you, established in the 1830s by these very integrated German Jews. And if we move on a little bit, and this is the streetscape around this area called Portobello. And Portobello is the area around what we call the Grand Canal, which sounds, very, very grand. The Grand Canal here is actually a very small body of water, which was never used, was never used to its full potential. And now there's really very little on the waterway at all, and it's really small. And it runs parallel to the Liffey for a little while. And around this area, around this particular part of the Grand Canal, a lot of property was being redeveloped at this time in around about the 1880s. And this was one of the driving forces behind this was an organization called the Dublin Artisan Dwelling Company. And the Dublin Artisan Dwelling Company essentially provided a lot of, relatively affordable housing, where there had been little housing. So we have houses like these. And I think this was the last slide I showed you last week. So I'm going to give you a little whistle-stop tour around the sort of Jewish area at the time. So this is what we call St. Kevin's Parade Synagogue, if you can see that. And it just really looks like a red brick house. And this was where the sanctuary, this is where the services actually took place in this front room. And seemingly they had a fireplace with Magen David, with Star of David tiles and black and white around the fireplace. But when the synagogue ceased to be in operation, which was really in the late 60s, apparently that those tiles were chipped off and sold. And this then reverted to be a private dwelling house again. So, we're talking a little bit about the adaptive reuse of space, because, you find a lot of spaces around Dublin, they're quite versatile. And I suppose this is a case in point where you've got something that was built as a home, became the synagogue of all things, and now it's a private home again. So if we move on a little bit, and I may have talked about this, this was just around the corner. So this is a very small area, and this is what was jocularly known as the Gates of Heaven Ajar in Oakfield Place. And it was called, as I think I told you, the Gates of Heaven Ajar, because apparently even then it was pretty derelict and you could see the sky through the roof. And then around the corner from this, this is a place called Lennox Street, and there was actually a very famous kosher bakery on Lennox Street, which is, the bakery is still in operation, but it's not under a license anymore. But people go there. But certainly they've modernized. They don't sell all the old-fashioned sort of Viennese things and the challahs and things that they used to sell, say, when I was growing up here. So it's all a bit modern, it's all muffins and sourdough. So no challah anymore. The reason I'm showing you this is this little place here, built as a private home, was a synagogue, reverted to a private home, and now it's a suite of offices. And there used to be Magen David's in that window over the door. And one of the reasons I wanted to show this to you was they actually had a choir. And the choir was very important. I mean, it was actually a real status symbol among Dublin Jews, certainly among the men and the boys. So who we have here is Reverend Buchholter, who was only in his 20s when this was taken. And he's got his little choir of 6 boys, 3 of whom, to be honest, are actually family members. And as the other 3 look quite alike, I suspect that they're also 3 boys from another family. But if we look closely, there is a perception, certainly in Ireland, and I can't speak for other countries because I've never lived in another country. I've only ever lived here. But there tends to be a perception about immigrants as being, poor and, ragged and coming with no resources and no money and no skills. But you see here, you see here the way the little boys are dressed. They're dressed in Eton jackets or blazers on this very, very elaborate lectern here. And, their little rosettes and their ribbons, and the Chazan himself is very respectable looking. Now, again, if you know anything about the topography of Dublin, you might know that, in fact, the area we're talking about is completely dominated by the 2 ancient cathedrals. So they're both there nowadays, certainly, and even then they were Protestant cathedrals, and both of them had very famous, and even now these are very famous choirs. And you can see here, they're just around the corner, and the Chazan is saying, well, let's just integrate. Let's make our boys look like the boys from St. Patrick's, that very long-established choir. And they have a status, and, they have their uniform. And though they look rather angelic there, apparently they were anything but. The next slide I want to show you, again, talking about the reuse of space. So we're still in the same little area, and I really don't know why it is misbehaving like this. I wish it wouldn't. No, there we are again. So this is the synagogue, what we call Lombard Street West. It looks like Lombard, but there's always some sort of funny pronunciations in the English language. And this is Lombard Street West Synagogue, established in 1888. And it was built as a factory. And then it ceased to be a factory, and then it became a furniture showroom. So I didn't have access to it for many years. I was very fortunate, I suppose, about 10 years ago when I took this photograph, that they were the place was open, they were redoing it, and the owners allowed me to come in and look around. And I mean, it was a complete tip, to be honest. I mean, it was used as a furniture storeroom, and you can see, it's full of just junk, full of junk. But interestingly enough, there were two things in place. The ladies' gallery was still in place because, we're talking about Orthodox, we're talking about the sort of mainstream Orthodoxy here. So we've got the ladies' gallery. And here, this little mahogany pelmet is actually where the Aron Chaudish, where the ark stood. Now, interestingly enough, if you're interested in these things, when we were in Dublin, generally the Aron Chaudish is in the east wall. Now, interestingly enough, this is the north wall. And this has happened in a couple of synagogues, including one of the larger ones I'll show you, where the sighting of the Aron Chaudish seems to be a little bit random. So anyway, this was against the north wall, and that's actually, let's see, that's in fact that window there. And I have a few eyewitness accounts, when I was doing a lot of oral history years ago, because I was leading an oral history project in Dublin for many years. And I came across two people, really quite elderly, who had remembered going there as children and remembered it was a very austere place. It was very dirty. It was very dusty. One of them said, there wasn't a scrap of carpet in the place. And apparently at the ladies' gallery, there was a big chainmail curtain. So whether that was to protect the modesty of the men or the women, I'm afraid I don't really know. That we just have to wonder. History does not relate. And this little bench here, which was in the Irish Jewish Museum, this actually was one of the benches in the synagogue. So, I mean, it's pretty uncomfortable looking, isn't it? So that's Lombard Street West Synagogue, established 1888, and I think it stopped functioning again in about 1967, 68, like a lot of these places did. So if we move on a little bit, so we're going to walk around the corner now. We're going to walk around the corner to Camden Street. And Camden Street, it's a really busy street in Dublin. So if you actually cross the canal, and if you're just going north into town from, where most of the Jewish population at this stage would have been, you're going to go up Camden Street, and you see there's a plaque. There's a plaque on the door, and the plaque says the International Tailors, Pressers and Machinists Union, established by Jewish workers in the synagogue, 1892 to 1916. And that was put up by Concern, which is, the charity over here, and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. I think that, again, there is a perception of Eastern European Jewry, certainly at this time, that it's a sort of a monolithic society where everybody is the same. But actually, it's a very complex, I mean, I'm sure you all know this, but I mean, just to sort of consolidate this, it's a very complex social and political patchwork from which, all sorts of movements are going on and have arisen. We've got in this monolithic society, so-called, we've got socialism, we've got communism, we've got nationalism, we've got secularism, we've got, a certain amount of religious extremism. And of course, we've got this push for self-determination. And this is really the meeting place, for certainly some of these socialists, these Jewish socialist workers who came over here. So, I mean, I think the perception is that not much actual prayer took place here, but it was a very important meeting place. And as you see, it didn't last as long as most of the other synagogues. So 1916, it had finished. And if we, look at the framework of Irish history at the moment, 1916 is a time of really significant political turmoil in Dublin at the time. And you can see where, you know, possibly people were absorbed into that, people probably left. But one way or another, the synagogue itself, you know, ceased to function. So if we move on a little bit further now, to Adelaide Road. Now, a few minutes ago, we talked about these integrated German Jews over in Mary's Abbey, you know, in their small synagogue over there. And in 1892, or, you know, really in the some years before that, in 1892, they took this decision, should I say by 1892, you know, they took this decision to move across to the south side of the city. Now, they didn't move exactly into Portobello, you know, so there was always this bit of distance, but they certainly moved literally on the banks of the Grand Canal, because at the back of the synagogue, actually, there was a little garden there, and the canal ran past that garden. Now, my father and his family, they were members in Adelaide Road Synagogue, and it closed in the late 1990s when the congregation amalgamated with Terenure Synagogue, which I'll tell you about in a little while. So Adelaide Road Synagogue was, you know, the building was finished in 1892 by, you know, quite a well-known ecclesiastical architect over here. And so here's a couple of pictures. Now, they are black and white. Here's a nice pencil drawing that was done some time ago. This is actually the interior of the synagogue. Now, and I have to tell you, it was very opulent. It was all red velvet and carpets, and, you know, very, very opulent place, very, very nice place. Central heating, which you didn't get in the other synagogue. So, you know, think of the contrast between this and Lombard Street West that I was telling you about. And also rather different from Mary's Abbey, which is this little tiny synagogue. So this really became a sort of a point of social mobility. So as I said, this was established by these Jews who had lived here for quite some time, but it became really a place where socially mobile, more recent immigrants came. And as I said, my father's family were members here for quite some time. And you remember I showed you the choir in Lennox Street. Well, here's another choir, the Adelaide Road Choir. And the Adelaide Road Choir really, you know, continued until the synagogue closed. And it was such an important part of the community here. And, you know, there were, you know, you can see, because it's Orthodox, it's men and boys, you know, and it was a 4-part choir. They sang, you know, a considerable amount. So during the Sabbath services, they sang any of the weddings that took place in that particular synagogue. They used to sing in. And as I said, there was an enormous amount of status belonging to that choir, and boys who came from other synagogues, so I'm told, they aspired to join Adelaide Road Choir. That's how important it really was. So that's Adelaide Road Choir. So if we move on a little bit, so as I said, you know, it's been converted. It's absolutely dwarfed by large buildings. So the planning here, it's actually in apartments now. So the planning require them to keep the facade, but actually nothing else remains now of the synagogue. And there's no plaque or anything, but that's what we see, the big doors. There was a basement here. They had a hall there. We used to go to terrific discos there in the 1980s. It was fun. But, you know, things change, things move on. So if we go to the next one, Reverend Gdansky was the rabbi in the synagogue. Now, it may interest you to know that, you know, during certainly part of this period, the chief rabbi Adler in the UK didn't actually like anybody else using the term rabbi. So there were a lot of Rabbanim that would call themselves reverend, because that was just the way it was. And we were very much affiliated with the London sort of synagogue culture, and certainly the United Synagogues. And, you know, we used their Sidorim, and, you know, very much the liturgy was the same until, you know, until actually quite recently. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that now. But this is Reverend Gdansky. His son became a High Court judge here and changed his name. He contracted it from Gdansky to Good, so he was Judge Herman Good. So, you know, this was if we look at him, this isn't, I mean, again, over here, I mean, I can't speak for other places, but over here there tends to be a perception, an external perception of Orthodox Jews as ultra Orthodox, the big hats and the payas and the big beards. But anybody, outside the Jewish community I've ever showed this picture to, they say, well, he looks just like a Church of Ireland, an Anglican clergyman. He has no beard. He's wearing, the dog collar that the Protestant clergy wear. He's got no beard, and his head isn't covered. So this is a very strange picture of an Orthodox rabbi, and yet, he was an Orthodox rabbi who served in Adelaide Road for many years, and it's. I mean, nowadays we'd call it cultural appropriation, but then, he's essentially, his decision was, let's try and conform, and we're going to conform with the other sort of main minority in the place at the time, and that, of course, was the Protestant. That was, of course, the Protestant population. So we've got the choir in their little uniforms, and now we've got Reverend Gdansky wearing his dog collar. So if we move on a little bit, here we have the synagogue, the cemetery that was built around about now as well in Dolphin's Barn, which is a bit further up the canal. And originally, it was just, there wasn't very much there, but now, in the 20s, then they built this very nice Art Deco, essentially, which the Tower House, we call it, like a chapel of rest. So it's, quite a nice 20s building with the bay windows and everything. This is inside the sanctuary itself, hand washing. And then this is the area for the Kohanim, because, like other Orthodox synagogues, of course, the Kohanim, they don't participate in the funerals themselves. So that there is a little corral for them. So that's the synagogue. So that's where burials take place nowadays. And I think I told you about the smaller cemetery on the outskirts of Dublin, but there haven't been burials there probably for I would say, since about the 1950s. And even then, I believe that was by special permission. So if we move on a little bit, let's move on a little bit. So here we have, so really here now in the late 1890s now, in the early 1900s, and if you look at the census, you see, this very large swelling of the Jewish population. So say in the 1901 census, there's, I think, maybe a little over 1,000, maybe 2,000 Jews. But by 1911, that had swelled, that had actually doubled. So we're talking about this time where the Jewish community is really, strengthening its numbers. And most of the Jewish children would have gone to Protestant schools, because unfortunately they weren't allowed in Catholic schools, because of the Catholic teachings and the catechism at the time. I mean, some of that has changed since Vatican II, but essentially even now, Jewish children in Dublin certainly would tend to go to Protestant schools when they don't go to the one Jewish school, which is very small and, in one particular suburb, which isn't always accessible. So mostly the Protestant schools around here would accommodate the Jewish students. I went to a Protestant school myself. It was a great experience. And, we used to be accommodated, certainly, late on the Friday. We were, during the winter when the days are very short here, we used to be allowed home an hour early so we could get home for the Sabbath. They were really, really very, very accommodating, very welcoming. And I'll always be grateful to them for that, always. My mother actually worked at the Church of Ireland. She was the head of music in the Church of Ireland Teacher Training College for many, many years, which was an unusual position for a Jewish woman to be, particularly as Jews actually couldn't train in the training college. So this was a very, it's a very strange paradox that, you had a Jewish head of music in this college, but you couldn't have Jews training to be primary school teachers. Equally, Jewish people, particularly the girls, couldn't study nursing. They had to go away if they wanted to study nursing. I knew a lot of girls, and my sister also knew a number of Jewish girls who had to go to London because the nursing schools over here were still very much run by the church. And there just was no possibility of Jewish girls being accommodated. Now that's all finished now, and that's not the case. But there are very few role models now. So unfortunately, you get really very few Jewish primary school teachers and very few nurses or midwives over here for that historical reason. But anyway, I went off on a tangent a little bit there. So this is a report from a school, from a Protestant primary school in the city centre near Stephen's Green, if you know anything about Dublin. And Stephen's Green is a very large park on the south side of the city centre, near our main shopping drag, Grafton Street. And it's a very beautiful park, with a lake and ducks and playground and lots of, beautiful planting and everything. And that park was actually left in perpetuity to the citizens of Dublin, so it can never be built over. Though I have to say that the successive governments have tried to break that trust, but the trust legally always seems to hold. So we've got this lovely park, and to the west side of the park, you've got this Unitarian church. To the back of that, we had what they call the Damer School. And I was fortunate enough to visit this place. So this was what was the schoolroom. There were 2 rooms. And nowadays, the College of Surgeons, which is a medical university, they rented off the church. But this was originally the schoolroom. And if we have a look at this text that I've given you from 1901, we see that the number of scholars on the roll was 49 boys, 82 girls, total 131 children. So this is a primary school. Average attendance for the 12 months ending 31st of September 1904, boys 42, girls 66.7, the total 109.5. The number of Christian children is 30. The number of Jews is 101. So, there's no reason to reject this particular statistic. I mean, this is in the archives. I just find this really fascinating that the number of Jews could outnumber the number of Christians in this one school by so many. And there were other small schools in the city centre at the time. And I understand that, the Jewish contingent within these schools was quite large. Now, I mean, given these are small schools anyway, but, they were certainly very well supported and very welcoming, as I said, by Jews. I had a look in the National Archive, and I found a reference to another school that was very popular, St. James's School, which doesn't exist anymore. But it was, you might say, down at the slightly seedier end of where Jews, the area where Jews used to live. A poorer region altogether. And St. James's, and the archives say there's this handwritten, housekeeping book from the governors, and it says, it talks about essentially how awful this school was. It's filthy dirty. The junior infants, that's the class with the 4 and 5-year-olds. They have no desks. And then it says salary is withdrawn from one particular female teacher who they say is insane. So it can't have been much fun to go to, but there were quite a lot of Jewish children went to St. James's just by virtue of the fact that they lived up there. So anyway, moving, as they say, moving swiftly on. So let's talk about Adelaide Road again. So do you remember I pointed out to you in the basement there was this area where we used to use it for discos and things, and it was nice. But they used to run actually a little school there, and the school sort of morphed over the years. The school morphed into a girls' club, and the girls' club used to put on concerts, and they used to do a lot of fundraising. So here's a little program of the one of the concerts that they had here, and we can see it's very secular. It's completely secular. So we've for instance, Miss Fanny Becker, Miss Fanny Cohen doing a piano duet, and we've got the song and chorus, The Language of Flowers. And interestingly, this little girl who was just a tot in 1906, she must have just been a toddler. That was actually my great aunt on my mother's side. So what we can conclude from this really is that, we have the men and boys participating in the choirs in the synagogues, but the girls are involved in secular music. They're learning the piano, and they're singing about the language of the flowers, and they're doing recitations, and they're playing violin solos and things. So this is all got up by the Adelaide Girls Club at the time. So that's their 6th annual concert. So they're established obviously at the turn of the last century. So if we move on a little bit, let's move on. So here we have a grand concert featuring the Dublin Jewish Dramatic Society. Now, I know it's ridiculous. I've scrolled on ahead a lot of time. I warned you last week I would do this. I would jump forward and I would jump back again. But again, I came across this very interesting program, and it's interesting to me because Rathmines Town Hall at the time, this isn't a little concert held in the basement of the synagogue, a private thing, this is in a big public hall. It's a very grand building. It's not a public hall anymore, but the building is there. It's I think it's a third level college now, and there's even a clock tower, and it's in this beautiful red brick. And you see, you can buy the tickets at Piggott's, so it's completely public. Piggott's was a music shop, in the city centre. So the parterre, the balcony, the pit. So they're certainly they're catering for all sorts. And again, you see, it's really quite, it's completely secular. So now we've got, Lila Feinberg, Hyacinth Goldberg, the mezzo soprano there. You see Ruby Watchman as the accompanist. We've got Arthur Robinson, you see the baritone. Leo Brill is an interesting chap, and we're going to come to Leo Brill a little bit later. Who's an interesting man. So, this is really a symbol of, a really strong community. That's very confident looking to the future. And, they're putting on these entertainments. They're not afraid of, wider public opinion. This is an entertainment that's open to the public, and there's no fear. And, it just shows a degree of, as I said, it shows a degree of confidence. So if we move on a little bit more, let's move on a little bit more. We also have the Jewish Social and Literary Club, which was essentially a gentleman's club. There's absolutely no artifacts left of this. The building still stands, except this bridge cup, won by my late grandfather, seemingly. And if we move on a little bit more, we can't really talk about Dublin Jews without talking about Ulysses, especially Dublin Jews in the early 20th century. And I have to say, the bad news is I'm no Joyce scholar. Really, I'm not. And you may ask me things afterwards if you choose to, but I can't promise that I'm going to be able to answer things. So anyway, in my various readings of Ulysses, I don't know how many of you have actually read through the book. I have. It's not an easy read, quite frankly, but for those of you who are, Joyce scholars, perhaps, it is more intuitive. But what do we know about Leopold Bloom? So we know he, this fictitious character born in 1866, the father is very, very complex here, a Hungarian Jew who converted to Protestantism. But of course, there's lots of references in Ulysses to the father's Jewish religious practice and, Yom Kippur and Pesach and everything. So we do have reference to this. The mother is Ellen Higgins, a Dublin Protestant, living in Clonbrassil Street, Portobello, where the Jewish population is living at that time. And Leopold Bloom himself, having this rather contested religious background, has not converted to Catholicism in order to marry Molly. And what we learn about him is that he's completely indifferent to Irish nationalism. And, this time in Ireland is a time when, nationalism is really, come to the fore. And we have, we have the Easter Rising in 1916, and we have the Civil War a few years later. So there's a lot of, Irish nationalism as part of the wider discourse. So if you read the Cyclops chapter in Ulysses, we find that there's tensions between Leopold Bloom and the character that we call the citizen in that chapter. And Bloom's Day is 16th of June, as I'm sure loads of you know, because that's the day that Bloom's personal odyssey is supposed to take place in 1904. And as I said, 1904 is the point at which the Jewish community in Dublin has started to expand quite dramatically. And of course, there is always a fair amount of discussion, or was this anti-Semitic, was it philo-Semitic, what were James Joyce's, what were his motivations at the time? And what we do sort of find as we read through is, well, he didn't really know very much about Dublin Jewish culture, and he wasn't even living in Dublin at the time that he wrote the book. And, he had a certain amount of help from other people, but, he does certainly mention quite a few Jewish, Dublin Jewish names in it. But I suppose I find, not being a Jewish scholar, I mean, I always find it somewhat irritating that, you might say Leopold Bloom is sort of the best known Dublin Jew in the world, and yet he's in fact, strictly speaking, not Jewish at all. And he doesn't exist. But I mean, some people, I think, invest this strange sort of reality in him. And, people take this odyssey, they walk around Dublin on Bloomsday, and we have this festival on Bloomsday that was actually set up by Jerry Davis, who was an Irish Jewish artist, a very successful Irish Jewish artist, who established this Bloomsday festival, and used to dress up, in a bowler hat and recitations and, pieces of, there'd be readings from Ulysses. So as I said, I had to talk about Ulysses a little bit, otherwise it would be irresponsible of me, I suppose. So moving on a little bit to 1917 now. So I apologize for jumping backwards and forwards a bit. So we're still having this tour around the Jewish area of Dublin. So this is Walworth Road Synagogue, established 1917. In the 30s, they expanded into two. So it used to be in this house, and later they expanded then into this house. And this is what you see if you go in there, because this is actually now the Irish Jewish Museum, and the old synagogue is intact. It's very much it's literally the way it was left when the synagogue stopped functioning in 1969. So if you ever come here, and I hope you do, this is what you'll see if you visit the Irish Jewish Museum. And then downstairs, it's more of a museum, there's more artifacts, but that is the synagogue. Even over the years, we've had people coming to get married there, and it's been quite nice. We've had concerts there. We just cover up our Chodesh, and that's what we do. So I used to be involved at the Jewish Museum, not really anymore, but I used to be volunteer there. And as I said, in the 30s, the synagogue expanded next door when the family here moved out. The family here, believe it or not, was actually my father's family, though this was before my father was born. And this is my father's much older sister and brother, and they're in front of this window here, and they're playing in a little toy car. And that's my Auntie Sarah. That's my uncle Emmanuel, Manny, and that's where they are, playing outside Walworth Road. So a little personal touch there. So let's move on a little bit further to Greenville Hall Synagogue. So Greenville Hall Synagogue has got a particular significance to me because we used to actually attend there when I was a child. So as I said, my father's family used to attend Adelaide Road Synagogue, but my mother's family always attended Greenville Hall. So when my parents got married, which they did in Greenville Hall, in fact, here's the proof of it, because this is a little snapshot of their wedding in the 60s. So my father then jumped ship, you might say, and joined Greenville Hall. Now, Greenville Hall, it was very grand. It was a very, very large space. It was huge. And when I was a child, because the place stopped functioning in the 80s, I think I was about 10. And essentially, our chazan, he died one Friday. He dropped dead, and that was it. They never opened the synagogue again. There was a tiny congregation at that time. I mean, there were literally about a dozen of us. And anyway, the synagogue never opened again. And I was fortunate, a couple of years ago, that the people that own the synagogue let me in and have a look around, and they're very sensitive in the way that they did it up. So still, we've got the Magen David windows that they're to the side of the building. They're actually still there. They're still intact. But it was a lovely place, but very empty as I remembered it. Very empty. But it was beautiful. It had a tremendously high ceiling. The chandelier. When I was small, when I was bored, listening to the sermons, I used to try and count the lamps on the chandelier, but I used to lose count all the time. Because when I was little, I used to sit downstairs with my father. It was only, and the synagogue had closed before I was old enough to sit upstairs with my mother. But I always used to sit down with my father, and it was a very interesting place altogether. Just a note of interest about Greenville Hall Synagogue. It was essentially built on a great edifice of spite, because you saw Adelaide Road, and I explained to you how socially mobile it was. and, you know, the aspirations of the people, the social aspirations of the people who went there. But Greenville Hall was essentially built by a number of these smaller red brick synagogues that I showed you. It was a number of those congregations got together, they raised the money, took about 10 years to find the site, and they built this vast synagogue. And the understanding was, we're going to build a bigger, better synagogue than Adelaide Road. That was what they wanted. That was really the motivations for building it. And human nature being what it was, unfortunately, a number of, you know, these smaller synagogues that decided, actually, we don't want to close up, we don't want to join this big one. And, you know, essentially the synagogue itself was always a bit bigger than it needed to be. And, you know, it had a big function room down at the back. You can't see it here. It was actually demolished a long time ago. But that was a very important secular space for the Jewish community. They used to have dances there and all sorts of things, you know, notwithstanding whether they were members in Greenville Hall or indeed any synagogues. So that was an important space. But so the synagogue closed in about 1984, 1983, 1984, something like that. As I said, very, very abruptly. It just stood there for a number of years then until it was sold. Very, very sad, a sad day. Fantastic acoustic, I have to say. So if we move on a little bit more, here's the choir. So there's a, you know, as I said, you know, being members of the choir, it's a very important, it's really a very important thing in the Jewish community. And here we have the choir in the 1920s. And here we have the United Hebrew Congregation, the new synagogue, so that's what I just showed you, having a Hanukkah service and assisted by the choir under the direction of choir master Brill. So do you remember in that program I showed you a few minutes ago, we had choir master, we had Brill, the baritone. Rabbi Dr. Herzog, very important man, will deliver a sermon, all welcome, and the Oberkantor Rosenfeld will officiate. And that's the Oberkantor there, and that's actually Reverend Brill is there. And this gentleman here was one of the little boys there in the choir. And that's what he told us. That's what he told us. And one of the problems with the Greenville Hall synagogue choir actually stopped functioning fairly early on because, and this is a terrible thing to admit, the Adelaide Road choir poached some of the boys and the men simply by offering them chocolate and a bit more money. And they actually went and poached. They went and poached these people. Terrible things. So unfortunately, the choir here didn't last very long. But the Adelaide Road choir actually used to go to other synagogues to sing at weddings and things. So this is quite an unusual picture to see the Greenville Hall choir, and Nick Harris was kind enough to show it to me. So let's moving on again. I'm not sure if this will work. So I'm not going to try. I'm not going to try because I'm conscious of the time. I had a recorder. Another project that I did was to record as many men in the community as I could, you know, singing Nusach and you know, singing their Bar Mitzvah Haftarah. So I've got quite a big archive, quite a big sound archive of that I amassed over the period of about 6 years. And a lot of those gentlemen are no longer with us. So it's quite an important thing. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Robert Briscoe, because again, you know, he's a very famous and actually real figure of Dublin Jewry, who was the Lord Mayor twice in Dublin. So, you know, an important position, very important within one of our major political parties, Fianna Fáil. And I'm always interested in his coat of arms, because there's really a lot of thought goes into it. So, you know, you've got the Star of David, the Magen David here, but you've got it superimposed upon the symbol of Dublin, you know, the three turrets here. And then you see you've got this bit of Irish text here, which essentially means it's you know, happiness, freedom, and I'm afraid I've forgotten the name of the translation of that. But you know, there's a lot of thought gone into it, and the, you know, the symbolism attached to this. And in our mansion house, which is the seat of the Lord Mayor, that's where this coat of arms hangs, along with the coat of arms of his son Ben, who was the Lord Mayor in the early I think 1989. He also became the Lord Mayor. So as I said, you know, he was a famous figure. He made a very high-profile visit to America in the 60s. He was also involved in the nationalist movement, earlier in the century. And you may, or people's views are mixed on his associations at the time, but that's the history. You can't change the history, and his motivations, I'm quite sure, were very reasonable. So let's move off that a little bit. So again, there is a bit of a perception in Ireland that people essentially, after the Free State was established in 1922, when we ceased to be under British rule, and the whole perception of Irish identity had changed, because up until that point, in a sense, Ireland was a fairly cosmopolitan place, but after 1922, you found that the whole notion of Irish identity was bound up with Roman Catholicism, and with that, of course, comes Irish culture. It comes, Irish music and Irish sports and the Irish language. And I mean, there is a perception that, people that aren't Catholic have no interest in these things. You could also argue that it is actually very difficult for people outside the sort of wider Catholic community to, in fact, to access these things. I mean, we will learn the Irish language at school. I mean, I learned it for the 14 years that I was at school here, but I took no further interest in it after I left. But a number of Jews became what we call Gaeligors, and that means, you're fluent, you're completely fluent and idiomatic in Irish. And that was necessary to practice law until relatively recently, and other professions as well. And here we have the Irish Language Society in Trinity College, where, again, where I was a student and I lectured there for a number of years. So here we have Saul Wolfson, you see, and this is in the early 1950s. And here we have this Jewish student, this young man, who's actually he's the president of this Irish Language Society. So sometimes I think there is an issue really with immigrants, or with people who aren't necessarily of Catholic extraction, and it just the perspective is, well, it's strange that they can do it at all, that they can speak the Irish language at all. This seems a very strange thing indeed, though it shouldn't be, because you can't have it both ways over here, which I think that sometimes people want. But anyway, moving swiftly on, if you want to educate children in whatever way, of course you do it in schools, and the first Jewish national school, and indeed the first sort of non-Christian denominational school, was established in 1935. Here's the foundation stone down here. So a lot of Jewish children in the area, from then onwards, would have left, the Protestant schools and attended Bloomfield Avenue. My mother did. I'd like to say that children actually liked it, but in fact, seemingly it was a very, very unpleasant place. And that's largely because most of the teachers there were essentially unemployable in other schools. So they wound up in this sort of weird, off the wall Jewish school. And there was a lot of, to be honest, a lot of sadies and a lot of bullying. It wasn't a nice place at all. My paternal aunt was taken out of it because she was beaten so badly in the school, but put into back into another Protestant primary school again. Another aunt of mine was taken out of her her original, what you call dame school, put in there. Oh my goodness, she hated it so much. But it was open for many years. It was apparently a beautiful building. They got planning permission because there had been a small school seemingly on the site before, and it's just in offices now. So that's 35. So let's just move on a little bit, because I'm just conscious of the time, and I want to leave a little time for questions. So we'll move on to the movement. You might say the movement of Jews from this central part of Dublin, the south, on the south side around the canal, to the suburbs. And this is the first synagogue in the suburbs. So it's not very far away, but it's about a mile and a half south of these little synagogues, and established in the late 30s. So if we contextualize the late 30s, if you read a lot of the literature on Irish Jews, and particularly Dublin Jews, there is this perception that, well, spontaneously in the late 30s, everybody just suddenly became wealthy and decided they wanted to live in nicer suburbs and moved out. And that's nonsense. I mean, some people probably did, but if we contextualize this in what was going on in Europe in the 30s, we find actually that the infection of anti-Semitism, it certainly was established in areas in Dublin. And one of the reasons then that Jews started migrating from the city centre was they didn't want to be in this area that was so closely associated with Jews. They didn't want to be all living together. They felt, it's literally the opposite of safety in numbers, and they didn't feel safe anymore. And that was the first synagogue that was established in this area. Now I'm going to finish up in a minute or two, just if there's any questions.
I will have questions for you in a minute or two.
Yeah, just in a minute or two. Yeah, so I'll finish up very, very shortly. Here is the Dublin Jewish Progressive Congregation in the same area, a few streets away. So very, very different. This was established after the war, and culturally it's quite different from the mainstream Orthodox. And if we move on a little bit further, this is the synagogue now. This is the only one that's open, and we are actually in the process, unfortunately, of selling it and moving to a smaller site. So this is in fact just around the corner from where I'm sitting now. If I left the door, I walked 5 minutes around the corner. That's where we'll be. And I took this picture from the ladies' gallery, and there's the Archardus. We've got some very nice stained glass windows. It's a slightly brutalist building. And I have to tell you, this area is very Art Deco. So there's no red brick. It's all very elegant and Art Deco. And then you've got the slightly blocky building. And then I just wanted to introduce you to the Maccabi Association. So this is the sports club that was established in the 50s. Actually, the very first ever Jewish football team that we're aware of in the British Isles was in fact established in Dublin in around about 1901. But this is a little bit later, and again, it's in Terenure near where we are. And in Maccabi, we did, it was a sports club. We did all sorts of things, and we used to put on shows and things there. And that's me. I was about 14 in a production of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoats, and I played keyboards. I am, a musician by inclination and training. History is, and like most people, where music is a bit of a hobby. History is actually my hobby. Music is my profession. So
I have some questions for you.
That's great. So I'm going to wind up now, and we'll hear a few questions then when you're ready.
This is not off topic, but we maybe a little bit tangential. We've had a lot of questions about the famine and how it impacted Jewish people, especially the memorials that came after it, like the sculptures by Rowan Giuseppe and so on and so forth. Can you tell us a little bit more about the famine and Jewish and how Jews were involved in it or affected by it?
Yeah, you see, the famine was very local to the west side of the country. And in that way, people living on the east side of the country, in places like Dublin and, right along the east coast, really weren't affected materially by the famine. So, that's important to note, that the famine was very local to essentially 2 counties, maybe 3, but, these were the worst affected, really, were Galway and Clare, and these west coast, very, very rural agricultural areas. So the Jewish community of Ireland, which at the time was mainly centred in Dublin. There's, a Jewish community in Cork, which again is nowhere near where the famine really took place. And of course, the community in Belfast, though that was more autonomous and certainly under the auspices of the Chief Rabbi of Britain. So, essentially we weren't materially affected by the famine, and that's why, you won't get Jewish memorials to the Irish famine, because, there just weren't Jews lost in the famine. The word Jewish, there was, there's a lot of evidence of Jewish fundraising, for victims of the famine. But in terms of, as I say, actual sort of people suffering from famine in the Jewish community, there were, it affected the West Coast, and B, there were very few Jews, living in Ireland in the 1840s anyway, and those that were, clustered in the north inner city. They certainly weren't living in Galway and Clare. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, great. What role did the Jews of Ireland have in 1916 in the fight against England for independence?
Yeah, well, like most of the Jewish population, at the time, and most of the Irish population, I mean, there is a perception, I think, that the whole of the country was up in arms. They actually weren't. And I remember in my school history book, I remember there's an account of it, and it said, Patrick Pearse read the proclamation of the Republic to a puzzled and indifferent crowd. And I think that is the case, that not everybody in the country was necessarily, I think, invested, in the War of Independence. And you find that with the Jews, there were essentially Jews on both sides. There were Jews that were, loyal to Britain because, as I said, we were essentially, certainly the liturgy and the synagogues were very much under the auspices of the United Synagogues umbrella organization in London. And then there were, of course, Jews that did actually fight on the other side, for independence. And a lot of those would have been, I mentioned before, people involved in other political movements. We understand that quite a number of Jews that fought in the War of Independence didn't live in Ireland at all. They actually came over from England, to join in the fight against Britain, which is, which is ironical. I mentioned Chief Rabbi Herzog, who you may know was originally the Chief Rabbi in Ireland, and then when the Republic was proclaimed, he was then appointed the Chief Rabbi of the Republic, and he went on to be Chief Rabbi of Israel. He did a very astute political move. He made a very astute political move in that he severed the formal links with the United Synagogues movement. So although we went on, to continue with the liturgy and use their prayer books, essentially, we had no formal tie with them because he reasoned that if we were still tied to London, we would essentially still be perceived as a bit British. And he didn't want that. He wanted to establish Irish Jews as Irish in this new Irish Republic. So I mean, he was a very astute politician, as well as a very learned rabbi. Now, does this? I hope this in some way answers your question.
Absolutely. And there's so many good questions. I'm so sorry we can't get through all of them, but was there a Hebrew school? Were there Friday night services? Were
Oh
these
yeah,
things we kind of have in the United States and parts of Europe, present there?
we still do. We still have. We actually have a morning and an evening every day on Friday night services. I mean, our main service would be on the Sabbath morning, which is very much along the British model, as I explained to you. And we have Hebrew school, we have independent Cheder. That's where most of us went to, because most of us, as I said, went to Protestant schools. I mean, my parents did, my grandparents did. It's perfectly common. And I said there is a small Jewish school, but it caters for a relatively small number of children. So we have the Talmud Torah, which was the the Hebrew independent Hebrew school, the Sunday school, I suppose you'd call it. So we always had that. We've always had that. So yeah, I mean we have all of those institutions that you would associate with any Jewish community, I suppose, on a smaller scale, because the main question that a lot of people will ask is, the Jewish population. I mean, at its peak, there were somewhat over 4,000, and that was towards the end of the 1940s. Nowadays, there's about 1,000 Jews in Dublin. So of course, that does affect the institutions. But until quite recently, we had, we really had everything. We were served for, all aspects of the religion and the culture. But as I said, things change, things move on.
Well, I have a question that you don't have to really answer till next week
Okay.
because it's relevant for next week. Do Jews feel fairly safe today? I know that you'll be talking about that and Jews in the 21st century next week, or Jews after 1945 in Ireland. Sadly, we have to end now, but this has been so wonderful. If you'd like to contribute to AJU's open learning program so we can make more programs for free like this, please click on the side in the chat, the bit.ly/donate AJU. And thank you so much, Dr. Brown.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.